Chapter 1211. Naomi paused for a split second, turned her head, and looked at Francisco, who just so happened to be glancing at her too. She then refuted Lucy immediately. Nonsense. Where are the similarities? Both our colors look very different, okay? Both of you have bright-colored clothing on, while mine is dark-colored. Lucy grabbed the hem of the front of her black down jacket and covered her chest and abdomen. Before Naomi could say anything, Francisco laughed. It's just a coincidence. After the meal, Lucy proposed that the three of them could go to the movies. And when they got to the movie theater, she skimmed through the several movies that were listed on the screen and decided to watch a horror movie. Let's watch this today and make it a challenge. What do you guys think? When more than two people were watching a horror movie, the atmosphere in the theater would become much more interesting than that of a romance movie. Especially when one was frightened, she could jump into the arms of the person who was sitting next to her. That had always been the reason horror movies were one of the best assists in kickstarting a romantic relationship. Naomi responded, I can go with anything. Francisco hesitated for a bit. Are you sure you want to watch this? Lucy nodded. Of course. However, Lucy soon realized that she had shot herself in the foot. She was the only one who got frightened throughout the whole movie, and there were countless moments in which she was that close to throwing herself into Naomi's arms like a baby. The terrifying sound effects and the storyline were basically acceptable to Naomi. Nothing in the movie could scare her at all. Francisco did not show any signs of being frightened either. Lucy felt that she had miscalculated. Lucy's legs were wobbly as she walked out of the theater, and they could hardly stay under her body. Didn't you find it scary? It's okay. Naomi looked at her. It's all fake anyway. Lucy was at a loss for words. This was her first time feeling speechless. Is this even a question of whether it's fake or not? Even if you're not scared, you should pretend to be terrified. Francisco glanced at the two of them while he was thinking about something. Lucy had run out of ideas, so she thought of another way and suggested, Are you guys thirsty? I'll buy you something to drink. Before they could answer her, she had already left. At that moment, only the two of them were left at the scene, and Naomi was even more at a loss. She secretly took a peek at Francisco, who was standing right next to her, and pursed her lips. By the way, how did you get my cell phone number? Francisco looked at her. I called your company and asked them for it. She was astonished for a few seconds, then looked away slowly and gave off an awkward smile. Well, you should be a very busy man, so we would totally understand it even if you really couldn't show up today. It's all right. All the tasks that should be done have been completed. Francisco inserted his hands into the pockets of his trench coat. I can't just eat my words after promising you girls. Naomi's eyelashes trembled, but she did not utter a single word. She then glanced in the direction where Lucy had headed. How about we go find her? Francisco squinted slightly and gave off a profound grin. Okay. Naomi and Francisco went to find Lucy, but they did not see her in front of any of the automatic drink vending machines. Perhaps she's gone elsewhere to buy them. Francisco seemed very calm as he looked down at his watch. She'll definitely contact you when she's done. Do you want to go shopping first? Naomi hesitated for a short while. All right then. The open-air cafes located on both sides of the street, in addition to drinks, also sold a variety of delicacies. Naomi walked beside Francisco, and she would turn her head and look at him from time to time. However, she did not dare to stare for too long out of fear of being discovered. At this time, it started to rain. The rain got heavier and heavier, and the passers-by who had come out without an umbrella were forced to hide under the shop's roofs to avoid the rain. Naomi and Francisco stood under the eaves. She was briefly caught in the rain, and her hair got drenched and a little sticky, so she lowered her head and tucked it away. Francisco handed her a pack of tissues. You can wipe your hair. Chapter 1212. Naomi was astounded for a bit and grabbed the pack of tissues from him. Thank you. He stared at the heavy rain. I don't think the rain will cease so soon. Naomi lowered her gaze and pursed her lips. In fact, she hoped that the rain would go on for longer. At that moment, Francisco's cell phone rang. He took a glimpse at the caller ID and walked away to answer it. Naomi turned her head and stared at his figure. For some reason, she felt like she was on a date. However, as soon as Naomi thought of the word date, her cheeks blushed inexplicably, and she covered them instantly. Why have my thoughts become so bizarre lately? However, what she did not know was that Francisco looked back at her at this moment and happened to witness the scene where she was covering her cheeks in panic. The sight of an innocent girl being in love was truly a feast to his eyes. Apart from this, Lucy's actions had all been so obvious, so how could Francisco not realize it? He lowered his gaze, turned around, and talked on the phone. It was not until the call was over that he turned to look at Naomi. Has your friend contacted you? She was startled. Not yet. Looks like she's had everything planned out. What? Naomi looked bewildered. Francisco put his phone away and gave off a faint smile. She's planning to make a match out of the both of us, isn't she? She was dumbfounded. Francisco stood in front of her. So, do you fancy me? Naomi's facial expression looked a little stiff. She could not help but clench her hands into fists and lowered her head. No. Naomi did not dare to admit she had a thing for him, especially right after he had revealed it. He responded with a hum. You should contact your friend. Something just came up, and I have to take my leave already. Huh? Naomi lifted her head. But it's still raining. He replied calmly, my assistant will be here to pick me up. It did not take long for Francisco's assistant to appear with an umbrella. He walked under his assistant's umbrella and looked back at her. I'm sorry. Naomi stared at their silhouettes leaving in the rain, pursed her lips lightly, and the initially red on her cheeks gave way to a layer of pale pallor. When the rain stopped, the air was filled with a heavy hint of dampness, and most of the dark clouds had faded along with the subsidence of the rain, leaving the sky a little brighter. When Lucy came looking for Naomi, she saw that she was leaning against the wall, and Francisco was nowhere to be seen, so she was curious. Hey, weren't you with Mr. Boucher when I left? Where is he? Naomi's eyelashes trembled. She slowly raised her head and forced a smile. He left a while ago. Looking at her slightly bleak look, Lucy asked, did something happen? Everything's fine. Naomi cheered herself up. The rain has stopped. Let's go home already. She walked by Lucy and left the scene first. Although Lucy felt that something was wrong, she did not know what happened and was too embarrassed to ask more questions in order for her to get to the bottom of the matter. Thus, she could only catch up to her and leave with her for now. At the same time, in the car, Francisco stared through the car window, and his gaze was fixed on the street. The assistant who was driving the car glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Weren't you on a date? Did you just leave the girl behind and leave? The assistant was stunned. It's not a date? Francisco retracted his gaze. We only had a meal together, but it rained halfway. The assistant understood what he meant. I see. The girl looks so innocent and pure, I was wondering if your taste has changed, and you've started to take a fancy to college students. A college student? Francisco laughed. She's the daughter of the Eastwood Enterprises owner, and she has already passed the age of a college student. The assistant was astonished. Oh, so she's Mr. Topaz's daughter. Everyone knew that Anthony had a daughter, but his daughter was so well protected that she had never appeared in front of the public. Not even the media could take a photo of her, so she had always been a very mysterious person. Chapter 1213. Francisco frowned and said nothing. I agreed to show up to the meal arranged by that woman named Lucy only because she said that they wished to extend their gratitude through a meal. It'd be rather rude if I were to say no to such a warm invitation. To this day, all of Lucy's actions have been very deliberate. It's obvious that she's trying to make a couple out of Naomi and me. I am not really sure if it's Naomi's intention or if she arrived at such a decision without Naomi's authorization. After his incident with Maisie, Francisco had been very wary toward all women. Nobody can guarantee that I won't run into another Maisie. At the hospital, Mrs. Hannigan was sitting beside the hospital bed and feeding Nathaniel congee. Because Nathaniel had just undergone a craniotomy and was still recovering, all he could do was basically lying on the bed, and he would need someone to raise the head of the bed if he wanted to get up. Tanner came in through the door at this time. Nathaniel took a glance at him, took back all the words that were about to escape his mouth, and chose not to look at him at all. Tanner. Mrs. Hannigan looked up at him. Your father has just regained consciousness, so please come and accompany him whenever you're free. Tanner responded with a hum. Nathaniel did not even utter a word. He continued to eat the congee Mrs. Hannigan fed him. I'll go back home and prepare dinner first. Mrs. Hannigan stood up after Nathaniel finished his meal, and she did not forget to adjust the height of the head of the bed and tuck the blanket for Nathaniel. After Mrs. Hannigan left, only the father and son were left in the ward. Nathaniel closed his eyes and refused to say a word from beginning to end. Since he did not speak, Tanner only sat on the side silently. Tanner stayed in the ward with his father for 2 hours, and his father had fallen asleep long ago. He was very annoyed and went to the stairway to smoke. He leaned against the wall and went through half a packet of cigarettes, one after another. Sandy sent him another text message, saying that she could be discharged from the hospital and would wait for him at home. Tanner narrowed his eyes. He was not sure if his eyes were irritated by the smoke or if it was something else. He put the phone back in his pocket after reading the text. He did not return home that night but went to a pub for some drinks instead. Pearl was woken up by a phone call in the middle of the night. She fumbled for the phone and answered the call. Hello. The other party said, Excuse me, are you Mr. Hannigan's fiancé? Mr. Hannigan has gotten drunk, and he's asked you to come and pick him up. Pearl opened her eyes, sat up slowly, and brushed her long hair backward with the palm of her hand. I'm not. You've called the wrong person. But Mr. Hannigan said before the other party could finish speaking. Tanner seemed to have grabbed his phone back. His voice was almost unrecognizable, and he sounded very drunk. Pearl, come and pick me up. Can you please come and pick me up? Mr. Hannigan, you've drunk too much. Pearl suggested calmly, you should call Sandy instead. Sandy, Sandy, Sandy. Tanner vented his dissatisfaction. Why must you always mention her? Don't you have anything else to say to me besides? Besides mentioning her? Pearl did not say anything. Tanner leaned back on the back of the chair and covered his cheek with his palm. Come and pick me up, just this once. Pearl came to the pub when it was already closed. Tanner was lying on the back of the couch, and a handful of wine bottles were lying on the table. He was only in a shirt, and his tie was extremely off-center. The door was open, so cold breezes would get in from time to time, making it feel freezing cold. Tanner, Pearl called out his name. He moved a little, lifted the back of his hand off his eyes, and looked at her. You're here. He sat up, stretched out his hand, and was about to hold her, but Pearl ducked back and took out her phone. I'll call someone here to bring you back. I don't want them to pick me up. Tanner swept the wine bottle off the table, and the shattering of the bottles attracted a lot of sideways glances from the waiters who were cleaning the pub. Pearl looked at him. Mr. Hannigan, please call someone else if all you want is to create trouble. I'm not in the mood to waste my time on you. Chapter 1214. A thorn seemed to have punctured Tanner's chest, and he felt as if he could no longer breathe. He was silent for a moment and then stood up shakily. Then take me back. The pub manager came over and said, Miss, please send Mr. Hannigan home. He's drunk too much. We'll get into trouble if something happens to him after he leaves the premises. Pearl did not utter a single word. Pearl saw the coat he draped on the couch, picked it up, and followed him out when they were leaving the pub. Pearl was about to cover him with his coat back in the car when Tanner grabbed her wrist abruptly and called her out drunkenly, but looked as if he was completely sober. Pearl. Pearl froze. She remembered suddenly that Tanner used to call her that in front of her parents a year ago. She smiled, but there was not even a hint of hilarity in her eyes. Are you still playing your part? But the play has ended. He did not speak another word. Pearl drove him back to the apartment building. She knew that Sandy stayed in this apartment too and wanted to send him over to Sandy's place. Thus, she was about to press on the number 13 to send him to the 13th floor when they got into the elevator, but Pearl wanted to pull her hand out of his grasp, but Tanner seemed to know her next move, so he tightened his clutch and took her into his arms. Tanner Hannigan. Pearl struggled in his arms. Tanner lifted her face and lowered his head to kiss her. The abrupt kiss assaulted her with a strong whiff of alcohol, and she was imprisoned in her arms, unable to move. The two doors opened, and Tanner dragged her out of the elevator, pressed her against the door, and continued to kiss her. She resisted with both hands, but there was nowhere to escape. When she noticed something, Pearl stopped him instantly. Have you lost your mind, Tanner Hannigan? I don't have anything to do with you now. You don't have any right to touch me. Tanner's palms ran through her hair. He held the back of her head and forced her to raise her head. So, does it mean it's okay if we're in a relationship? Pearl was momentarily stunned and turned her face away from him. That will never be possible anymore. She turned around and wanted to leave immediately, but Tanner grabbed her wrist and carried her into the apartment. Pearl was shocked by what was going to happen, and the fear that she had experienced in the past spread within her. Her hands and feet turned cold instantly, and she trembled from head to toe. Tanner, please don't. Tanner did not care at this moment. Under the influence of alcohol and his inner desire, his urge to own her intensified. He stopped her crying with kisses, and wiped her tears away with even more kisses. Every single steamy movement that followed was a shocking sight and a captivating scenery at the same time. Cold breezes could be seen brushing through the plants sitting outside the window in the endless night. Pearl curled up on one side of the bed and stared out of the window with a blank gaze. Tears were gushing down the bridge of her nose and wet the pillow. Besides her, Naomi also stayed up all night. The light in Naomi's room was still on, and Anthony saw it through the crack of the door when he woke up for some water, so he knocked on her door. Nellie? Naomi was astounded. She quickly covered her drawings with a book, got up, put her cardigan on, and went to open the door. Dad? Anthony frowned. It's already dawn. Why haven't you slept yet? Are you busy with your work? She lowered her gaze. I went to bed too early, and I can't sleep now. That's why I'm reading a book now. Anthony sighed. Don't you have to go to work tomorrow? You should grab some rest even if you can't sleep. Otherwise, you'll feel fatigued tomorrow. She nodded. Okay. After Anthony left, Naomi closed the door and leaned against it. She did not feel sleepy at all, because of what had happened earlier today. It seems that Mr. Boucher has misunderstood me. But I do have a thing for him. Was it a misunderstanding? The next day, Tanner slowly opened his eyes and woke up. Thinking about what had happened last night in a trance, he sat up immediately, saw the messy bed, and knew that it was not a dream. Chapter 1215. Tanner put on his clothes and walked out of the room. Someone was making breakfast in the kitchen, and a pleasant scent wafted out into the living area. He walked over in a hurry, but what he saw was not the person that he had in mind, and his expression stiffened slightly. Sandy placed the fried egg on the plate, turned around to look at him, and smiled. Have you woken up? Tanner frowned. Sandy. It's you. Why are you here? Sandy brought the breakfast to the table without any trace of emotion on her face. Have you forgotten what happened last night? What happened last night? Of course, I haven't forgotten about that, but I clearly remember that the woman I came back with was Pearl. So how did she become Sandy after last night? Sandy called his name and turned to look at him. I waited for you all the time. I waited for you for one whole day, and you didn't even come back to me. Tanner's lips were pursed into a single line. I know. You can't touch me now, because I'm pregnant, but you have your needs, so I really won't mind you doing what you did, but, Sandy's eyes turned bloodshot, but she still had a gentle smile on her face as her eyes feared up. But why her? The moment she saw Pearl in the morning, she was on the verge of having a mental breakdown. The marks on Pearl's neck did not only hurt her, but also mocked her. Tanner is mine. So how can he accept such a woman? It must be because I'm pregnant. Tanner remained silent. Sandy walked up to him, stopped in front of him, stretched out her arms, and hugged him. If you don't want this child, I can have an abortion. I don't want to make you unhappy, because I'm pregnant, and that's why you regret your decision and want to go back to her. Even though she's not chaste or perfect, her family background is better than mine. Your family wants you to choose the right woman, because such a wife won't embarrass you. That's why she's a suitable candidate. However, you said you're not one of those people who would listen to his family's arrangements blindly. You said you have your own will, you'll choose the woman you like and won't admit defeat to fate. Sandy's shoulders shuddered as she sobbed softly. But you changed after I got pregnant. You've become indifferent and impatient with me. I have nothing else apart from you, and I've given everything to you. That's why I've chosen to compromise. Sandy. If you don't want children, I can always abort it. Even if you can't give me a proper identity and status, I'll still be willing to stay by your side and be your shady mistress. A trace of gloom and ruthlessness flashed across Sandy's eyes. She refused to believe that her sugar-coated words could not soften his heart. Sure enough, Tanner melted with pity. He supported her by her shoulders, glanced at the woman in front of him who was desperately in love with him, and felt extremely guilty. I'm sorry, Sandy. It's not because of the child. There was a drop of tear hanging on Sandy's lower lashes, which would invoke anyone's sympathy. So, do you want the child? Tanner stared at her, but the image that flashed across his mind was Pearl's misted and enamored expression from last night. Since it's my child, then you should of course give birth to it. Sandy plunged into his arms. Then will your father like this child? He answered absent-mindedly, he might like it. At the hospital. Tanner sat on a bench in the corridor and leaned forward with his elbows propping against his thighs as if he was thinking about something. Mrs. Hannigan came out of the ward. Your father is asking for you. Tanner got up and walked into the ward. Want to marry Pearl? I'll never let that woman get married into the Hannigan as long as I'm still alive. Chapter 1216. Tanner stood next to the bed and looked at his father. What about the child? Nathaniel was quiet for a few minutes, but his expression didn't change. I can accept the child but not the mother. Tanner seemed to know that was what his father would say, but before this, he would debate about it with his father, but now. Had Pearl influenced him or the accidental child? He was in chaos. After he left the hospital, Tanner drove to La Perla. The employees all knew about him and Pearl. On top of the scene at the wedding, the news was everywhere, and the people started chattering when he showed up. Didn't Mr. Tanner run away with that woman and left his to-be wife? TSK. What's the point of coming to see Miss Santiago now that the wedding is over? Such an asshole. What asshole? I think Mr. Hannigan is the victim here. Other than Mr. Hannigan, who would be willing to marry her? I heard that he already had a girlfriend before he was forced to marry her, but the Hannigan wouldn't accept her, so they were forced to break up. He could have rejected it. He agreed to it and then reneged. Does it make him look bad after opening up her wound? When Tanner got out of the elevator, he went straight to Pearl's office. Pearl stood in front of the cabinets in a light green blouse with a silver necklace and asymmetrical black leather skirt, showing off her curves. He stood there and stared at her. Pearl had a nice figure which was even better than Sandy's, but they had been sleeping in separate beds even when their parents asked them to stay together to build a connection. He would never have thought that anything would happen between him and Pearl. They had just been acting. Even after getting married, she would just be the daughter-in-law of the Hannigan and his wife on paper. Men could see marriage as beneficial, and marrying a woman he didn't love for the benefits wouldn't affect him, or so he thought. However, he didn't know when things started changing, but it was very subtle. She was true to him at first, but he no longer saw love in her eyes after a while. Even when he was flirting with Sandy in front of her, she never cared. "Did you get the medication that I asked for?" Pearl thought that it was her assistant until Tanner spoke. "What medication?" She paused. When she turned and saw that it was him, she took a huge step back and bumped into the cabinets. Tanner saw that and took big steps to pull her into his arms, putting his palm to where she bumped into the cabinets. "Are you all right? Let go of me." Pearl pushed him away and pointed at him. "I don't want to see you ever again. Get out of here." "Get out?" Tanner pushed her hand away and cornered her to the table. "I was too impulsive last night, and I apologize for that. But you knew that she was pregnant, yet you asked her to come over. Did you do that to anger her?" Pearl paused before looking down and sniggering. "If you think I did that, then I did that. You can leave now." She pushed him away but was pulled back when she started walking away. "You admit it then?" Pearl wouldn't look at him nor say anything. Tanner turned her over and forced her to look at him. His eyes scanned her lips, which were pressed together. "Pearl, I hate you acting this way." Chapter 1217. "Leave then." Pearl looked up. "I'm not like your Sandy. I won't lower myself to make you happy." Tanner grabbed her by her chin. "You keep bringing her up. Are you jealous?" He inched forward. "Jealous that she's cleaner than you or that she's pregnant with my child?" Pearl had heard all the negative things about her, but these words hurt her more than any of them. Even if she didn't care, they still hurt. She was finally numb to them, but Tanner was the one who kept walking all over her numb heart. Her eyes were dead and hollow as if there was no soul behind them. She was quiet. Tanner noticed something and pressed his palm to his cheek. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that." He hugged her and gave her a little squeeze. "Let's start all over again." Pearl melted in his arms, but her eyes looked away, and she smirked. "Don't you love Sandy? How could you start all over again with me?" Tanner frowned and didn't answer. Pearl removed herself from his hug. "A dirty woman like me will never be as pure as Sandy. Weren't you trying to avoid this as much as possible? What's wrong? You've changed your mind after just one night?" He stared at Pearl, her eyes filled with mockery. He didn't like that. He didn't like how she stared at him and hated how prickly she was. Only last night did she show that she had feelings, that she could be hurt, could cry, could feel fear. Tanner held her cheeks and kissed her. Pearl clenched her jaw, annoyed because it was so easy for him to get to her. She bit his lips, and he retracted as the smell of blood oozed out. She pushed him away and was going to run, but Tanner still held her in his arms. She yelled, "Tanner Hannigan, let me go." He threw her down on the couch, pulled his tie, and then dropped it to the floor. Meanwhile, Sandy was preparing some snacks at his place. She heard the doorbell ring and excitedly ran over to open the door, but her face dropped the moment she did. A man grabbed her by her face, which made her lose her balance and knocked her forehead on the wall. The man grabbed her by her long hair, and she screamed out in pain, but two other men closed the door and stood guard outside. "Lenny, please give me more time, I beg you," Sandy said frantically. Lenny, who was grabbing her by her hair, smiled and tightened his grip. "I've given you enough time. I haven't seen any of the $450,000 in the past half a year." He pulled out a knife and lightly grazed her face with it. Her teeth chattered, which made Lenny smile. "What's wrong? You've gotten Mr. Hannigan. Can't he give you $450,000? Sandy was shaking from head to toe, and her tears were rolling down her cheeks. No, I'm not a Hannigan yet, but don't worry, I'm pregnant now. Once I give birth to my son, the Hannigan will give you any amount. Lenny chuckled and let go, but he immediately kicked her, and she bumped into the wall. She subconsciously grabbed her belly when she fell down, but the sudden sharp pain turned her face ashen. Ah! Lenny twirled his knife and squatted down in front of her. Do you think I'm an idiot? You're not even married to him, but you've already changed your number and moved away. My boss puts me in a tough spot because of my debt daily, and sometimes I even get beaten up. Listen, Sandy. You're not going to have a good life if I have a tough one. I know you well enough. When you marry into the Hannigan, you'll pretend that you don't know me. Huh. I'm giving you 3 days. Chapter 1218. After 3 days, if I don't see the money, he put the knife under her chin, I'll post all those naked pictures of yours so that Mr. Tanner can see what his girlfriend would do for money. Sandy's shoulders were shaking, and the pain in her belly turned her pale. Lenny finally left with his men. Sandy noticed blood coming out between her legs and opened up her skirt to check. The pain made her drop to the floor in tears. She took a deep breath and crawled up to the couch to call Tanner, but Tanner didn't pick up. Pearl's assistant walked out of the elevator and saw Tanner walking out with his jacket in hand and no tie. His shirt was wrinkled too. The assistant was surprised, but Tanner walked past her straight into the elevator before she could ask. She pushed the door open. Miss Santiago, Mr. Hannigan. When she saw the scene, it made her freeze. Pearl was curled up on the couch with only her underwear on, her hair was a little messy, and she could see marks on her skin. The assistant brought her clothes over and covered her up. Mr. Hannigan did this? Pearl didn't answer, but looked away. Her assistant felt horrible. Why would he do that? How could he? That's disgusting. Pearl looked up, and her voice was coarse. Don't tell anyone about this. I don't want anyone to know, I beg you. She was broken enough and didn't want the rumors to destroy her completely. The assistant could see tears in her eyes, so she hugged her by her shoulder. All right, I promise. On the way leaving La Perla, Tanner received a call from the hospital. The caller said something, and he immediately rushed toward the hospital. Sandy was sent into the operation room, and Tanner rushed over. Sandy. He was stopped outside, but he grabbed onto the doctor. What happened? Are you her boyfriend? She lost a lot of blood because of her miscarriage. How could you leave her home alone? Lost blood because of miscarriage. Tanner's body swayed when he suddenly remembered a few missed calls from Sandy. He lost his footing. It was his fault. He had left her because a lot was going on in his mind, but he didn't expect the phone calls to be for help. He leaned against the wall and covered his face with his hands. He was such a jerk. After an hour, Sandy was pushed out of the operation room, but she was still out because of the anesthesia. Tanner stood outside the room and looked at her lying there, feeling deeply guilty. The doctor walked over and looked at him. Sir, I'm afraid you need to be mentally prepared. Tanner was surprised. Why? The doctor frowned. Didn't you know that your girlfriend had a history of abortion? Her uterus walls are really thin now, and after this miscarriage, I'm afraid she won't be able to have children anymore. Tanner's face froze. He looked toward the room again with a dark expression when the doctor left. After a long time, Sandy woke up and saw him standing by her bed with a dark expression, and she burst out crying. Why didn't you answer my calls, Tan? Did you know how much pain I was in? We lost the child. Tanner was feeling guilty, and the guilt lingered in his heart because they had lost a child. After all, he hadn't picked up her calls, but after the doctor told him that she had a history of abortions, the way he looked at her had changed. Seeing how cold he was, Sandy stopped crying and put out a hand toward him. Tan, why are you looking at me like that? Do you think I didn't protect the child well? It's not my fault. I wanted to protect him too, but someone came and beat me up because they didn't want me to give birth. I'm in so much pain. Chapter 1219. Tanner pulled his hand away and calmly asked, "What happened?" Sandy was stunned, and then a tear rolled down her cheek, looking delicate. "Would you believe me?" Tanner looked at her. She propped herself up meekly. It was Miss Santiago. She didn't want me to have this child, so she sent someone to beat me up and caused the miscarriage. Tanner was still silent. Sandy sobbed. "It was all my fault. I shouldn't have gone back to you. I shouldn't have dreamed of becoming your wife. My poor child, he hasn't been born and hasn't seen the world yet, but he has already left. Tan, I'm so sad, I don't want to live anymore." Tanner rolled his eyes and helped her lie down. "Take a rest, don't be silly." "Tan," Sandy looked at him, "would you leave me now that our child is gone? I've lost my son, so I only have you left." Tanner looked at her calmly. She was still the woman he loved, the delicate woman who needed his protection, but he could no longer be sure whether her love and delicate state were real. After a moment, Tanner slowly parted his lips. "Sandy, have you ever lied to me?" Sandy was stunned and noticed that he was colder than usual, so she started to panic. Did he notice something? "Tan, do you think I'm lying? You don't believe me?" "I'm not talking about the child." Tanner's eyes were dark. "The doctor said you won't be able to have kids anymore. Do you know why?" That made Sandy freeze. The anxiety in her heart rose to her face, and she slowly turned pale. "No, Tanner, I don't know, I really don't. You never told me you had an abortion." Sandy felt as though she was struck by lightning upon hearing this, and suddenly forgot that the doctor could tell if she had had an abortion before. Since she had had too many abortions, the nurse had reminded her about it, but she didn't expect she would lose this child. She nervously grabbed onto Tanner. "Tan, I can explain, you said you had never been with any other man when we broke up." Tanner stared at her, his expression vague. "Yet, you've had multiple abortions before." Sandy's shoulder shook. "Tan, I can explain. I lied to you. After we broke up, I had a boyfriend because I wanted to get over you. I dated him because of that. But he cheated on me and even hit me. I had a miscarriage because he was abusive when I was pregnant." She cried while she grabbed onto his hand. "I really didn't want to lie to you, but I was afraid. I was afraid that you wouldn't love me anymore. He was the only one, and I regretted it." Her sobs filled the entire room. She had such a terrible experience, which made Tanner think of Pearl. Had he ever felt bad about the way he treated her? Tanner pushed her hand away. "Take a good rest. I'll see you tomorrow." "Tan, will you really come to see me?" Sandy felt that Tanner was avoiding her. Had he had enough of her? He nodded. "All right, I'll be waiting for you here." Sandy didn't try to make him stay. He knew about her abortions, so it was obvious that he no longer wanted her. Chapter 1220. However, was Sandy going to give up just like that? Lucy and Naomi went to the cafe nearby to try out some newly launched cakes during lunchtime. The cakes here are quite nice. A lot of people are talking about them on Instagram, and that's how I was poisoned. Naomi was curious. "What do you mean poisoned?" Lucy paused. "That means I wanted to try them really badly. When someone online recommends something so that everyone knows about it." Lucy then tapped her head. "Don't you go online a lot?" "I think you're quite young, but there seems to be an age gap between us." Naomi pushed her hair behind her ear and smiled awkwardly. "I'm not a fan of social media." "That's why." Lucy took a scoop of cream. "But I can understand. A socialite like you probably is very strictly controlled by your family. It isn't surprising that you don't have time to go online." Naomi smiled but didn't answer. She had no idea how to explain her past. By the way, Lucy looked around and leaned in to say, Did you know that Mr. Boucher is actually Helios Boucher's cousin? Naomi paused, then nodded. Yes, I've heard of that. Did you know all along? Lucy was surprised and felt ashamed. I'm glad you knew. I almost made it worse for you. She then said, listen, that Mr. Boucher was a playboy back then, and I heard that he impregnated a lot of women and even caused their miscarriages. By the way, that woman was a Hannigan, the sister of the man who eloped, but she wasn't a good person anyway. I heard that she's in prison now, and it was because of Mr. Boucher. Naomi's hand that was holding the coffee cup paused, and she looked at her. How did you learn that? Lucy smiled. I just heard it from someone. You know, I just love gossiping. She then looked really serious. Anyway, it's best to stay away from them, as far as possible. But I don't think he would do that. Naomi looked down. It's all just rumors, and there is never solid evidence since no one knows the truth. Lucy thought about it and figured that she was right. Even though that was the rumor, Miss Hannigan was not a nice person, so who knew what the truth actually was? She looked up. You're right, but we don't know the truth either. To be safe, since we've lost contact with him, let's not. Before she could finish, she saw someone, and her face turned pale. Naomi turned around and saw Francisco standing up and saying goodbye to someone. They were just a walkway away. Lucy was stunned. She raised her hand to cover her face and lowered her voice. Oh my God, everything I said. Since Francisco had his back facing them, she didn't notice it was him, and they were pretty much literally talking behind his back. That was so embarrassing. Francisco walked past them and stopped. He looked at them and smiled. You seem to be very interested in my past. Lucy blushed. No. No, I was just talking nonsense. Francisco took a look at Naomi and walked away. Naomi watched him leave through the door and stood up. Wait for me here. Lucy looked at her. Where are you going?